George Antheil, the piano composer who patented a system of missile guidance with Hedy Lamarr, was obsessed with Tartar Mongols. If he were living today, the Tartaria rabbit hole would have surely sucked him in. But when a 1931 Soviet propaganda film laid out the erasure of the Tartar way of life, he, like most others, saw that erasure as a form of progress, and he called Shostakovich's musical score of the film the best he'd ever heard. Tartar Mongols were a sort of obsession for George Antheil, and this obsession seems to be what attracted him to his Hungarian wife Baszki, as we saw when he fantasized her as a Tartar woman galloping along the puszta. Not only that, but Baszki was with Mongols on the day George first laid eyes on his future wife. The two men with her were young, evidently brothers. They looked as if they were Mongols. Perhaps George felt they had something in common, because Antheil also described his own Polish relatives as Mongols. While a company of various buxom or bewhiskered Mongol-faced peasants in their Sunday best, our relatives, stand in the background. Remember that the terms Mongol and Tartar are essentially interchangeable. They were distinct peoples at one point, and during the medieval and Elizabethan periods, the people living in Tartary and Siberia were generally called Tartars or Mongols. But as the names Tartary and Tartaria were erased from maps, so was the Tartar name. The Mongols eventually absorbed the Tartars through conquest, and by the 20th century, the term Mongol had almost completely replaced Tartar. All things Mongolian seeped into Antheil's music as well, which Adrienne Monnier critiqued this way: "It seems to me that his music has a great and salutary influence upon the body, like the Tibetan and Mongol rhythms that Antheil has studied a great deal." The marriage of a Mongol or Tartar aesthetic with the Mandel family of the lucrative ammunitions industry was the epitome of a contrast. The place where war was fought for free, now linked to perpetually funded commercial warfare and ammunitions. George and Baszki would eventually have a dog that he called a Mongolian fishhound. And in 1938, George wrote an article in which he mentioned a 1931 Russian movie called Alone. Of the movie's musical score, he wrote that Hollywood would never understand the long screeching flute and clarinet solos floating over the Mongolian wastes. The movie Alone is pure Russian propaganda. A fictional story about a young Russian teacher, Yelena Kuzmina. She's living in Leningrad, just starting out in life, when she's abruptly sent to teach Mongol Tartar children in Siberia. When she arrives in the mountains of Altai, she sees a startling Tartarian symbol: the skin of a horse hung on a pole. In his 1580 book for the Muscovy Company, John Frampton writes that this was a common burial ritual where the horse skin would be stuffed with hay. After this, the friends of the deceased take another horse and kill him and eat his flesh and fill the skin full of hay, and sewing it together, raise him up with 4 pieces of timber upon the sepulchre, in token that there is one buried, and the women do burn the bones, saying that they are for the purgation of the soul. It's a particularly Tartarian custom, and if you're curious about the erasure of Tartaria, this film lays it out as follows. The Tartars are shown a written Soviet rule that anyone who slaughters young livestock is an enemy. During Soviet collectivization, this was a rule laid down to help enlarge the size of herds. But the nomadic Tartars in the Altai Mountains wouldn't need to be told not to slaughter young sheep, and this is borne out later in the film. The reason they wouldn't need to be told was specifically explained by Adam Smith in his 1776 book Wealth of Nations. The Tartars understood better than the Spaniards, according to Smith, the difference between wealth and money. Money was a static medium of exchange, but wealth was a dynamic resource. Herds of living cattle or sheep were capable of producing resources necessary for survival, including milk, wool, and more young sheep to maintain or even grow the herd. A cow or a sheep was a literal unit of capital. The economic term capital derived from the Latin caput, meaning head, and evolved to mean an economic resource that was still living and capable of producing ongoing wealth into the future. A slaughtered animal could no longer produce milk, wool, or young, and this is why the Tartars already followed this unwritten rule. Of course, a slaughtered animal does produce a short-term supply of food, but the cow or sheep that's eaten in hunger destroys its power as capital. And that's okay. We get hungry and we consume some of our stock. But once consumption happens, we're no longer doing capitalism. When cow becomes beef or sheep becomes mutton, capital becomes commodity. Capitalism, future wealth, becomes consumerism, the consumption of commodities right now. Ironically, the Soviet rule against slaughtering young livestock was an ancient rule for preserving capital, and the capitalism the Soviet rule represented was rejected only politically, not in the reality of everyday human survival. This is one of many examples of cognitive dissonance that emerged in collectivist, communist, or fascist group-based regimes. Understanding this is central to understanding basic economics. The Tartars understood this, which is one reason they had to be collectivized and re-educated by teachers like Yelena. But very few modern populations understand this reality, largely thanks to propaganda like this movie. Armchair economists on Facebook and Reddit absolutely flip out when I explain the original meaning of capital. They seem to prefer the modern definitions that have been bastardized and complicated by government economists. And because capital is so misunderstood, I put together this short PDF you can access for free on my website. The link is in the description. So while the Tartars understood the wealth contained in living sheep, the new teacher did not. And there's a scene in the film when Yelena tells a Tartar woman, "I'm here for the sake of the children. Why would I care about your sheep?" Obviously, this line would be absolutely lost on most people watching the film today, but it's screaming something to us if we have the ears to hear it. The Soviet teacher doesn't understand how capital functions. She wasn't taught this, and she won't be teaching it to these Tartar children either. Yelena was excited to teach them the new technology of the collective farm system, and she really didn't care about ancient nomadic herding traditions. A new character then enters the story. The old Tartar man tells Yelena, "I have sold the sheep for meat to a good man." The good man turns out to be someone with a private trading license granted by the village Soviet. He carries an abacus for calculating a price, and so the Tartars go from herding and tending the sheep as living wealth to slaughtering them for meat, trading capital for money. The man with the abacus is the visible symbol of this transition. He's doing monetary calculation, converting capital into a price, and extracting a one-time value from what was previously a self-reproducing asset. The Tartarian capital-based economy is being converted into the Soviet commercial, consumerist economy, and the propaganda of the film is that this represents progress. The Tartar woman then rides up with members of her clan, holding a position of authority as female Tartars often did. In fact, John Frampton wrote in 1580 that the Tartar woman was essentially in charge. When the men have no wars, they keep their cattle, go a-hunting, exercise themselves in wrestling, and do nothing else. All the rest of their affairs remaineth in the charge and oversight of the women. And Yelena, who now suddenly cares about the sheep, warns her of the slaughter. The Tartar woman was promised protection by the Russian rep for the village Soviet, but he now tells her he can't interfere with the private trading license, the same type of monopolistic license that all corporate governments grant to their preferred traders and merchants. A license for private trading is the corporate jurisdiction mechanism. The state grants permission for commercial activity, collects fees or taxes for that permission, and then uses the license as a shield against accountability for what happens under it. The Soviet has created the problem it's now being asked to solve. The Tartar woman does see the corruption and lack of help coming from her local village Soviet, and even calls the leader out on it. But she believes that the new village Soviet will be better. The Soviet, the collective council, was structurally similar to the Roman Senate, the Italian chamber of the corporation, and the American municipality, in its basic logic that the individual is subordinated to the collective body. The word Soviet means council group. The word fascism comes from fasces, the bundle. Both function to bind the individual into a collective body. And the Soviet system forced upon the Tartars was called the collectivization. The civic municipality in America was a euphemism for Roman corporate governance. All of this was the underlying revelation of the movie Citizen Kane. It doesn't matter if you're called a communist, a fascist, or an American. They're all structured the same way. Finally, Yelena attempts to travel to the station to see that justice is served. But the driver taking her abandons her in the snow and she ends up near death. At this point, the Soviet in Leningrad broadcasts its intention over the radio to send a plane to rescue her. Because most Russians had no radios to hear these broadcasts, they were transmitted on loudspeakers. And back in the Altai Mountains, the same Tartars that have looked either angry, blank, or confused for the entire movie are suddenly smiling big smiles full of white teeth the moment they see the Soviet airplane. The musical score of Shostakovich drowns out the Tartarian Topshire lute. And the final image is of the plane taking off toward the modern, technological, collectivist city of Leningrad, flying over the symbol of ancient burials and the complete erasure of the old Tartarian way of life. Mongol enthusiast George Antheil describes this last moment of the film. Shostakovich comes as near a solution of the problem of movie music as anyone. His brittle soundtrack score bristles with striking tunes, striking discords, striking orchestral effects, usually upon one or two instruments, and many striking againsts. But it builds and builds right up to the end when the Soviet airplane takes off and the music does likewise. Antheil seems completely taken in, even inspired by the Soviet airplane, saving the life of the teacher who is unwittingly annihilating the Tartar Mongol way of life. And that's likely because he's been brainwashed by the film industry's propaganda too, which is the same industry from which he makes his living. Even though he was just a musician and composer, George Antheil wasn't unfamiliar with the politics of Soviet Russia. And in Bad Boy of Music, he mentioned his respect for our great Russian ally. Antheil had wanted to fight in World War I, but he was too young, so instead he worked as a munitions inspector for the U.S. Army. A prescient move, considering his later wife would be part of the extended Mandel Ammunitions family. His desire to fight seems also to have been channeled into his music, as was described by Adrien Monnier. He boxes with the piano. He riddles it with blows and perseveres furiously until the instrument, the public, and he himself are knocked out. When he is finished, he is red. He sponges his forehead. He comes down from the ring with his forehead lowered, his shoulders rocking, his brows knitted, his fists still clenched tight. Political positions and the wars that seemingly sorted them out, that was a big area of intrigue for George Antheil. He even wrote an amazingly well-informed political pamphlet, anonymously, called The Shape of the War to Come, in which he predicted the attack on Pearl Harbor within a month of it happening. Talk about someone with military intelligence connections. According to Robert Riley, writing in Crisis magazine, in other writing pursuits, Antheil produced The Shape of the War to Come, published in June 1939, in which he predicted the events of World War II with astonishing precision. He missed Pearl Harbor by only a month. The editor of the Los Angeles Daily News was sufficiently impressed to make him the paper's war correspondent. A war correspondent for the Los Angeles Daily News? Just another job that came easily to such an uneducated but well-connected man. In fact, his contacts and friends gave him astonishing access to all levels of government, the military, police, the entertainment industry, the art world, even publishing. Antheil actually wrote a column on endocrinology for Esquire magazine, despite the fact he never finished high school. In his autobiography, he described it as his hobby. Years ago, a roommate of mine left me all his books, which happened to be on only one subject, endocrinology. Lacking reading matter at the time, I read them. Then I applied my newly won knowledge to crime detection, greatly interesting the Parisian police. Like Orson Welles, who would later hire George Antheil to write the musical score for The Lady of Shanghai, a movie about faking someone's death, George Antheil was another fake. Another charlatan. Not only was he procuring jobs he was never qualified for, he also staged riots at his concerts in Paris, stunts similar to the riot caused by the War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles. One of the friends Antheil made in Paris got his younger brother Henry a job with the U.S. State Department. But it's hard to know exactly where George Antheil actually stood politically. Because of his involvement with Hedy Lamarr and the patent meant for the U.S. Navy, it's been assumed he was a pro-military, pro-war, pro-capitalist, red-blooded American, opposed to Italian fascism, German Nazism, and Russian communism. But was he really? He respected our great Russian ally and was close friends with both a communist and a fascist in a way that never seemed to violate his American sensibilities. What do a communist, a fascist, and an American all have in common? Rome. A communist, fascist, and American all rely on the common political foundation of collectivism, popularized and legitimized by Roman corporatism. In many ways, George Antheil was Citizen Kane. The friend who got George's brother hired by the State Department was William Bullitt, his friend from Paris who had been sent to the Soviet Union as a diplomatic emissary in 1919. 14 years later, he would become the first U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, but in between those two missions in Russia, Bullitt lived in Paris, where he and his wife Louise often entertained George Antheil and Bosky Marcus. As a young man, Bullitt had been sympathetic to Soviet ideals, though the worst that had ever been said about him publicly was that he was a radical. While a journalist, Bullitt, who was also well-connected, was sent to Russia by the socialist advisor to Woodrow Wilson, Edward Mandell House. I've written about House and his little book, Philip Drew, Administrator, in which the main character overthrows the U.S. government. Drew rejects state ownership of production in favor of systems that seem more fascist than communist, though the book was written by a socialist. And it's doubtful that Edward Mandell House would seek help from Bullitt in Russia without some overlap in their political worldviews. Once he got to the Soviet Union in 1919, Wikipedia tells us Bullitt noticed that the streets of Moscow were covered with corpses of those who had starved to death, which Bullitt blamed not on Bolshevik policies, but on the Allied blockade. Bullitt met Lenin at the Kremlin and came away impressed. Bullitt reported to Wilson that Lenin was straightforward and direct, but also genial and with a large humor and serenity. His sympathetic take on Lenin and the Bolshevik policies led him to recommend the U.S. lift the blockade on Russia, but that idea was rejected. Bullitt then angrily resigned from the delegation. But 14 years later, when FDR wanted to establish diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, Bullitt's unauthorized attempts at exactly that were now valued by the U.S. government, and Bullitt was made ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1933. Bullitt's wife Louise had been the widow of John Reed, a prominent communist who fought with the Red Guards in 1918. Louise had spent time in Russia with Reed and wrote a book, 6 Red Months in Russia, sympathetic to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. According to Wikipedia, her first husband, John Reed, attended the opening of the Third Congress of Soviets, where he gave a short speech promising to bring the news of the revolution to America, saying he hoped it would call forth an answer from America's oppressed and exploited masses. Louise's second husband, William Bullitt, seemed to want something similar. William Bullitt and Louise often invited George and Bosky over to their home in Paris, and again, spending time with those sympathetic to communism didn't seem to violate George's pro-American sensibilities. William and Louise divorced in 1930, and this may have been when his radical views began to change. 3 years later, George would contact Bullitt for his brother. He writes in Bad Boy of Music that Henry asked George to write him a letter of recommendation to my old friend William C. Bullitt, who had just then been appointed our new ambassador to the Soviet Union. This recommendation landed Henry a job in the State Department, where Henry was responsible for maintaining cryptographic communications devices and their codes and ciphers in the Soviet Union and Northern Europe. However, Henry was killed 7 years later. While serving as a diplomatic courier, his passenger plane was shot down over Estonia by 2 Soviet bombers. Henry Antheil had been carrying several diplomatic pouches, and some researchers believe the pouches included secret information detailing the Soviet Union's future plans for the Baltic region that the Estonian General Staff had turned over to an unidentified U.S. government official earlier that same day. Once the Soviets had killed his brother, George Antheil gained a renewed sense of patriotism, which he then poured into his music. I had put everything I knew into this symphony. My grief over the loss of my brother Henry, my growing feeling against isolationism. But into my 4th symphony, mostly, had gone El Alamein, Stalingrad, those were successful battles for the Allies in World War II, and the new America I saw awakening. For today, a new America was arising, one not at all the old sentimental isolationist America of yesterday. It was America of the world. This passage from his book seems to be explaining a pivot from isolationism to a full embrace of America engaging the world in war. But did this pivot ever really occur? He had attempted to fight in World War I, had instead worked as a munitions inspector, had married into a munitions family, and attempted to offer a patent to the U.S. Navy on missile guidance. I'm sorry, but I'm having a hard time believing this man was ever truly a pacifist or an isolationist. Antheil also had a close friendship in Paris with the outspoken right-wing fascist Ezra Pound, also without any violation to his American sensibilities. The reason, again, goes back to what these three systems share in common, their collectivism. But there was more to this relationship than the ability to navigate the ways in which their politics may have differed. The bond between them may have been their shared interest in Tartar Mongols. Antheil, the avant-garde pianist, met Pound, the avant-garde writer, in 1923. Within 2 months, Pound had written a glowing, though unreadable book on George's music that even Antheil couldn't take seriously. But there's something in this book that's relevant to collectivism, that Pound, Antheil, Bullitt, even Citizen Kane all found an acceptable political foundation. The book was called Antheil and the Treatise on Harmony. In Bad Boy of Music, Antheil touches on it briefly, admitting that he had given some of his early notes to Pound after he asked if by any chance I had written anything about my musical aims, and I said, yes, I have. Among other things, I said that melody did not exist. The tension, in some cases the outright war between harmony and melody, is a topic I cover in the next octave in Chapter 5. In that chapter, I highlight the duality of harmony as collective sound and melody as the expression of individualistic notes. Melodies are generally phrases expressed one note at a time as the melody line moves forward through time. Harmony is achieved by grouping notes into chords in separate, momentous bursts. Melody can be seen, then, as a line occupying horizontal musical space, while harmony can be seen as collections of stacked tones occupying vertical musical space. The synthesis of the two is the oscillation between vertical and horizontal biases in a completed waveform we call music. At the time I wrote this, the horizontal and vertical nature of harmony and melody just seemed obvious, and I had not read Ezra Pound's book on Antheil. But here on page 11, Pound addresses the same concept and accuses history of a bias toward perceiving the melodic. The early students of harmony were so accustomed to think of music as something with a strong lateral or horizontal motion that they never imagined anyone could be stupid enough to think of it as static. It never entered their heads that people would make music like steam ascending from a morass. His imagery is expressed here with the musical notation of a chord stacked vertically, as opposed to the horizontal line of melody populated by notes that are expressed individually rather than collectively. His argument is that history has held an unnecessary bias for the horizontal melody line. But of course, he and Antheil are wrong about that. The music theory coming out of ancient Greece, with the lesser and greater perfect systems, were based on a social theory of harmony that, just as Antheil and Pound would later do, sought to punish the individual note, as I write about here. More generally, the goal of preserving harmony as a social good has been the justification of many restrictive policies implemented by governing bodies throughout history. Equating harmony with a just society was common in ancient Greece, and its philosophers and sages believed that music was not merely analogous or instructive, but actually provided the mathematical underpinning of abstract concepts like justice. The Greeks attempted to pattern society with the musical structure of harmony, assuming that societies were meant to function harmonically. Following this reasoning, the melody, as it was likened to the individual, should always be tempered for the sake of a harmonious society. In other words, the Greeks assumed that societies were meant to function collectively, and when necessary, at the expense of the individual. For Antheil to offhandedly claim that melody does not exist is an expression of the same fascist view that Mussolini held regarding the nature of symphonic music, promoting collective discipline. Symphonic music is largely expressing vast harmonies across instrumental sections of the orchestra. Mussolini's argument against Caruso and the other singers is that one individual vocalist can't express harmony, as there's no way for the vocal cords to produce more than one orthogonal note at a time. Lyrical arias, then, are full of horizontal, individualistic melodies that, according to Mussolini, would fail to promote collective discipline. Pound continues. Hence it is arrived that the term harmony is applied to the science of chords that can be struck simultaneously. The chords struck simultaneously, that's the percussive, weaponized fascist piano of Casella, the unofficial musical propagandist for Mussolini's fascist regime. And this seems to be the reason that fascism didn't violate George Antheil's American sensibilities. It's because fascism supported his deeper musical sensibilities. But as I mentioned earlier, Pound and Antheil also shared an interest in the areas of Mongolia and Tartaria. The overarching writing project of Pound's life was his cantos, that he began in 1915 and continued on through 1962. In the Chinese cantos, Pound had taken a historical account of the Chinese and the Tartars, ancient enemies, and retold those stories in free verse. And I must admit that his take on these wars is economically accurate, echoing what Adam Smith had earlier explained in Wealth of Nations. In Canto 55, published in 1940, Pound shows that the commercial nation of China stood in opposition to the Tartarian nomadic system of war for free. War for China was perpetual, with standing armies pulled away from their productive activity, while taxation paid for it all. The army 800,000 not tilling the earth, and half of the empire, Taozi Ho-Changs and merchants, so that with so many Ho-Changs and mere shifters, 3/10 of the folk fed the whole empire. Yet Hien reduced the superfluous mandarins and remitted taxes. Men are the basis of empire, said our Lord Hien Song, yet he died of the elixir, fooled by the eunuchs, and more Tucson, Tartars, were raiding. This excerpt from the poem is all about economic production. Who is producing wealth, primarily the food necessary for survival, and who isn't. The poem is lamenting the death of the ruler Hien Song around the year 800 AD, who had, in life, removed the non-productive mandarins, the mere shifters, which were the Taoist priests and Buddhist monks, who produced nothing. The Ho-Changs and merchants also produced nothing. They were middlemen organizing the commercial consumption of the war machine, paid for by taxing the 3/10 of the folk feeding the whole empire, the people who actually were producing value and wealth. Hien Song also remitted taxes, meaning he suspended the high taxation, paying for war, that the rent-seeking class was siphoning. But when Hien Song died, the Tartars were able to once again invade China. This is because, when his policies that eliminated people consuming without producing ended, China was weakened again, to the point that the Tartars, with their ancient system of war for free, and who never underwent such weakening policies, were able to invade once more. Later, Ezra Pound would be institutionalized in a mental hospital for not only expressing his larger views on economics and war, but for explaining them using his own personal hatred for a specific group of people. He was quoted in the New York Times in 1942 as saying in a radio broadcast that Jewish bankers operating in the City of London had orchestrated and financed World War II by mobilizing Russian Tartars against Germany. What Pound got right here is that, yes, the banking cabal centered in the city of London, a municipal corporation established by the Romans in 47 AD, had been orchestrating and financing war for profit. What he got wrong was that the banking cabal was Jewish. The cabal isn't defined or empowered by its race, religion, or ethnicity. It's defined and empowered by its legal structure. Its corporate structure that removes liability while legitimizing and implementing legal fictions, including the fictional representational paper money that war is financed with. Pound couldn't see this because it was the corporate structure of Italian fascism that embodied his hope for a political solution to economic usury. As he said in another 1942 broadcast, "What bloody chance has the stray man, the individual, in old-style so-called democratic organization, in comparison to what he has in a corporate system, embodied system?" The reason that George Antheil didn't directly identify with Pound's fascism or Bullitt's communism is because he found the most comfortable form of collectivism for him: Americanism, the practical synthesis of left and right, where the only real argument between Democrat and Republican is how best to elevate the Roman corporate mindset. Should the corporation be for-profit or non-profit? Should the corporation protect women or protect men? Should the corporation distract the people through sports or music? Should the corporation form its war as a policy for economic growth, or as the musical ideal of social harmony that can perfect the untempered world by conquering it militarily? Because without that important dichotomy, you'll never get the gun-toting hunters and the blue-haired artists willing to fund the same war with their taxes. Next time, we'll try to wrap up the psychological artistry involved in financing war in a way that makes sense of someone like George Antheil, the blue-haired artist who liked his guns and ammo, ending up in Hollywood.